Okay, hello everybody. So if you're a subject leader for languages in your school, as you know, if you are to be getting an Ofsted style deep dive, or probably the sorts of conversations that you might be having with your line manager, would be to be able to articulate and explain why you have a strong languages curriculum. Now, there was, it might be worth referring to this, you don't necessarily have to have read it, but Ofsted did a research review in June 2021, and it summarised, especially in the first part of it, summarised what a strong MFL curriculum would look like. And it mentioned in particular 3 pillars of language learning, which are phonics, grammar and vocabulary. And even if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, I would mention those 3 things and say they were based on the Ofsted research review, and therefore even if you haven't got time to go and read it, it sounds like you have looked at what you're supposed to be looking at, looked at evidence. And I would actually say that although Juliet and I wrote this scheme of work before this review came out, our scheme of work very much follows those 3 pillars of progression, and you need to be able to sort of articulate and explain how the children are making progress through those 3 pillars of the curriculum. So it needs to be planned coherently. So children are building on previous knowledge, and our curriculum is a spiral curriculum. So whatever they do in year 3 is then revised and revisited quite a lot over that year, because children need to have access to new language and new structures between 6 and 14 times with a new language. That's what the research says. So you've got to keep revisiting and revising, probably even more so than the sorts of other subjects that you might be teaching, like history and geography, because language and new words are so abstract and so strange, as it were, that to make that understanding and that knowledge stick in the brain, you have to keep revisiting it. So the revisiting is important. Then into year 4, you'd revisit what they've learned in year 3. So you'd start in year 3, for example, with verbs in the first person, which is things like I am, I have, I do. You'd revise those, you'd keep working on those into year 4, but then you'd move on to the he and she is, he and she has, he and she does, and so on. So high frequency verbs, but you move to a different person, so you can talk about it in the he and she form. Into year 5, you'd add in the we, for example, we do this, we are, we have, but you'd also include the near future tense, which would be I am going to do something, I am going to play football. And it's a really simple structure in French, and it gives you access to a whole different time frame, which is the future tense. Into year 6, you'd probably form the full conjugation of high frequency verbs. That's actually what the Key Stage 2 national curriculum says that children should be able to do by the end of Key Stage 2. So you'd have to be able to say they do things in the present tense, but also to extend it a bit more and give you access to another time frame. You would ideally teach a couple of set phrases in the past tense, which in French is the perfect tense, which is je suis allé, I went, or j'ai joué, maybe I played, that's a really good one, or j'ai visité, I visited. In Spanish, that would look like fui, I went, or jugué, I played, or visité, I visited. So really simple phrases. You don't need to teach the full way to form the past tense, but you can teach some set phrases, and therefore hopefully you can see that the children are making progress and that you can see the key elements of knowledge. Sorry, I'm at work at the moment, and that's my
Thank you.
Sorry about that. That was the tannoy that I can't switch off in my office. So I'm still at work. So that's an example of how the curriculum is planned coherently. And then the 3rd bullet point is about children understanding and remembering what they've learned. And that has become we all know this idea of retrieval practice and recycling. I have to say that's what language teachers have always done, because you can't afford not to as a language teacher, because the children do forget very quickly what you've taught them. So we've always done that. And if you are using our scheme of work, you'll see how that occurs frequently. Do you want to move on, please, Julia? So these are the 3 building blocks of language learning for the purpose of curriculum design. And as I said, if you don't remember anything else, just remember those 3, because they are absolutely essential. They are also part of the government has just put out a new style GCSE, which current year 7 children, so all of the children you're teaching in primary and current year 7s are going to be taking this new style GCSE. And it's very much focused on these 3 pillars. It was based on the Ofsted research review. And so you are preparing children well for the next steps in their education if you're doing that as well. Do you want to move on, please, Juliet? So in terms of planning, the way that we need to plan is to think about our composite performance. So what is the final performance? And you could use an analogy of a marathon. So the final performance in a marathon is to be able to run the 26 miles in a reasonable time. But the different composites of that, components of that performance, are things like the mental strength you need, stretching techniques, practicing different types of running like speed and endurance, being aware of the nutrition that's needed for a good athlete, which I think is lots of carbs, for example. And all those things are different components that you need to know and put together to be successful in your final performance. And it's very much the same in language learning. So maybe the final performance, or what would make a good language learner, will be being able to have at the end of Key Stage 2 a simple conversation in the target language where you're understanding with the questions being asked, you're able to reply, and you can talk about a variety of different topics, maybe like family life, you like your hobbies, maybe what you like at school, maybe what you did last weekend, maybe what you're going to do soon. So that would be an example of success, but you've obviously got to teach the different components of that, which would be successful verbs in the past, present and future tenses. It would be pronunciations of the phonics of the language. It would be putting it all together with the right vocabulary, so you know the words for hobbies and for school subjects and for food. If you want to talk about what food you like, you actually need to know all those different aspects. And so what the end result looks like, it doesn't always look like what the individual lesson activities will be doing to practice what that eventual performance will be. And that's what planning, probably in lots of other subjects, but particularly in language learning, is very much about. Juliet, do you want to move on? So I've got here examples of progression frameworks in phonics. So you've got French phonemes listed. So there are 36 phonemes in the French language compared to 44 in English. There are 25 phonemes in the Spanish language. You don't need to teach every single phoneme because many phonemes are identical. So for example, between French and English, the M phoneme in mum and in mère is identical, as hopefully you can hear my pronunciation. The P phoneme, as in police and pair, is identical. So children aren't going to make mistakes with those phonemes. There's no need to teach them. So you only need to focus on the difficult phonemes that are different when you compare the two languages. So we've got a list here of the key phonemes to teach and a suggested progression model. Now, there's no exact right or wrong model in terms of progression, but the main thing is you'd focus on the most high frequency phonemes that come up first, and then the less frequent ones you do later. And obviously you have to keep revisiting them over and over again so they stick. So you do need to have a progression model in phonics and a clear rationale. And actually, Michael Wardle, who is the lead Ofsted primary MFL person who goes around and looks at all the inspections of deep dives in primary languages, looked at a sample of 100 of these, and he pulled out the fact that I don't think you could find in any school where phonemes were well taught in a clear sequence. Just like you would teach the English phonemes in a clear sequence, you do need to do the same in French and in Spanish. There are less phonemes in Spanish that are different between French and English. So there's just 16 that you need to focus on. Spanish is wonderfully a very phonetic language. It's 99% phonetic. So really what you see is what you get. Once you've learned how to pronounce it, then everything is pronounced pretty much the same. French is not quite as much because it's got the silent letters at the end of words and you've got to teach that rule. But actually French is very, very rule-based. And once you've learned the rule in French, it is nearly always the case. It's not the same in English. English is only 40% phonetic. The reason why so many readers struggle with learning English, and we have so many dyslexic children, is because our language is a mishmash of lots of different other languages due to William the Conqueror and the Anglo-Saxons invading us. So we've got a bit of a mishmash. We've got rules, but lots of exceptions. And so it makes it so much harder to learn English. But actually, the converse of that is it's so much easier to learn French and Spanish. And so the phonemes are so important and very, very useful. Juliet, do you want to move on, please? And then we also need to have a progression model for grammar. So when you are talking to an inspector or somebody in a deep dive scenario or discussing this with your line manager, you need to be able to describe a rationale for your progression in the second pillar, which is grammar. Now I'm showing you an example here. This is the example from our scheme of work. Verbs are the backbone of a language. So you do need to have a very clear and strong progression in verbs and be able to justify and show how verbs get more and more difficult. When I say the backbone, it's sort of, you can't, as you know, you can't have a sentence without a verb in it. And then you can almost imagine the vocabulary is like the branches that come off it. And you could take a verb like je suis, I am, and you could add lots of different items of vocab onto that. You could say je suis un éléphant, I'm an elephant, or you could say je suis fatigué, I'm tired. You could say lots of things with that. You can use lots of different items of vocab to make meaning out of that. But your verbs have to be really clear. So you can see here, as I described earlier, a clear rationale for how the verbs get more difficult. You'd also need to look at gender in year 3, which is the concept of masculine and feminine, which doesn't exist in English. So it's a new concept for children who are learning French and Spanish. And so you need to sort of talk about this in quite a lot of detail. Children, if you say it's le chien, the dog, and la tortue, the children often think it's a male dog and a female tortoise, but it's not like that. It's the word itself that is masculine and feminine. And it's worth talking about that with inanimate objects like a table. La table is feminine and le livre, the book, is masculine. And so just that concept in itself is something that is really important to embed in the early stages of language learning, because from that flows adjectival agreements, for example, which come into year 4. And possessive adjectives are also linked to that, as you can see following on. So that's another important key thread that needs to go through a progression model of grammar. Juliet, if you want to move on, please. And that's an example of a Spanish progression model. It's very similar to what I've just described. You've got your articles, the words for the and which are different in Spanish according to the gender. And then also you've got your adjectival agreements, which are the same, and you've got your verbs, which become progressively more difficult. The HFV stands for high frequency verbs. And obviously, not only do we have to do it, the program of study says we have to, but it makes sense to focus on the high frequency verbs, which unfortunately in both French and Spanish are irregular. So they don't follow a common form, and you've got to teach them, and the children have to learn them separately from the more regular verbs. Juliet, do you want to move on, please? And then finally, we've got vocabulary progression. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but if you look at the topics that I've included here, these are the main sort of topics that you would normally include at the beginning of a language learning scheme of work. So before we used to have primary languages, we just used to start in year 7, and these would be the topics that you would cover in year 7. Because you only have one lesson a week over 4 years, you are tending to get really to pretty much the end of where we would have previously got at the end of year 7, maybe halfway into year 8, depending on how much curriculum time you have. And this will be a natural progression model. You can see that numbers increase. So we go from numbers 1 to 5 to 1 to 10 to 1 to 15. Then we move into year 4, 1 to 31, which gives us access to dates. We go into opinions. Our opinions get gradually more difficult over time, and you revise previously taught opinions. You'd obviously have things like greetings and classroom instructions at the beginning, because that makes sense. And then you move into things like parts of the body, food, personal descriptions in year 4, moving into sports, hobbies, weather, classroom, transport into year 5, and then telling the time, where you also need to know your numbers, daily routine, countries, houses, opinions, and so on. And we also need to include cultural capital aspects. So children should ideally learn about the fact that French and Spanish are not just spoken in France and Spain, but in many other countries across the world. And so doing something around that would be important, and also looking at festivals and how, say, Christmas, Easter, April Fool's Day, and other traditions are celebrated across those countries.